Chapter 18 of True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ernest. True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World by Adolphus W. Greely. Schwatka's Summer Search. On fame's eternal camping ground their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead. O'Hara. Among the startling and too often believed stories of the polar regions are many which have their origins as whalers' yarns. Spun for the purpose of killing time and of amusing hearers, by repetition and circulation they attain the dignity of reliable personal accounts. Among such credited yarns in the early 70s was one to the effect that the missing records of the proceedings and discoveries of the lost squadron of Sir John Franklin were to be found in a cairn which was located near and easily accessible from Repulse Bay. Told and retold with an air of truth, it became the foundation on which was based the Schwatka Gilder search of King William Land. This expedition sailed under the favoring auspices of the American Geographical Society of New York on the whaler Eothen, from which landed at Repulse Bay the party of 5, Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka, United States Army, W. H. Gilder, H. W. Klutschak, F. E. Melms, and Eskimo Eberbing, known as Joe. In establishing their winter camp near Chesterfield Inlet, they adopted as closely as possible native methods of life as to food, clothing, and shelter. In the intervals of hunting trips, they ran down the several yarns on which their search had been planned, and were dismayed to find that they were entirely unfounded. Schwatka was not the man to turn back without results, and so he determined to visit the regions in which the Franklin party had perished, hoping that he might be able to throw new light on the disaster. If he had been deceived as to the Franklin records being cached at a particular point, he possibly might find them elsewhere, as records must have been somewhere deposited for safety. It was a daring venture, but there might be a possibility of more thoroughly examining King William Land when snow-free. The more striking phases of Schwatka's unique and successful experience in the search are told here. During the winter there was much visiting to and fro with the Eskimos camped near them. They soon found that there was a bright side to life among the Inuits, and that the natives indulged in games of skill much as we do. Gilder tells of the men playing the game of new glue tar, which demands a quick eye and alert, accurate movements. A small piece of bone is suspended from the roof by a line made of walrus hide, and a heavy weight dangles below it to keep it from swinging. The bone is pierced with 4 small holes, and the players stand around armed with small sticks which they jab at the bone, endeavoring to pierce one of the holes. Someone starts the game by offering a prize, which is won by him who pierces the bone and holds it fast with his stick. The winner in turn offers a prize for the others to try for. It is not a gambling game, but by prizes it encourages the acquirement of keen eyesight and accurate aim, so needful to success in hunting. With the opening of April 1879, Schwatka's party took the field, crossing the land in as straight a line as they could to Montreal Island near the mouth of Back River. 12 Eskimos, men, women, and children, were added to the party, and with their 42 dogs they hauled about 2½ tons, of which less than 1/4 consisted of provisions of a civilized character, bread, pork, beef, coffee, tea, etc., being food for 1 month only. Travel overland was very difficult owing to the rocky region traversed, which stripped the runners of their ice shoes. He says, "The ice is put upon the runners the first thing in the morning when coming out of the igloo, which was built every night. The sledge is turned upside down, and the water, after being held in the mouth a little while to warm it, is squirted over the runners and freezes almost immediately. Successive layers are applied until a clean, smooth surface is acquired, upon which the sledge slips over the snow with comparative ease." Of the Uk-Juliks they met with, Gilder says, "Instead of reindeer gloves and shoes, they wore articles made of musk ox skin, which had a most extraordinary effect. The hair of the musk ox is several inches long, and it looked as if the natives had an old-fashioned muff on each hand. They explained that it was almost impossible to get near enough to kill reindeer with arrows, their only weapons. An old Ukjulik said that he had seen a white man dead in a ship which sank about 5 miles west of Grant Point, Adelaide Peninsula. Before the ship sank, the Inuits obtained spoons, knives, etc. from her, and the story seemed true from the number of relics of the Erebus and Terror in their possession. The explorers visited Richardson Inlet, where they were told that a boat had been found by the natives with 5 skeletons under it. The most important information was gained from a Netchilik woman who said that on the southeast coast of King William Land, she, with her husband and 2 other men with their wives, had many years ago seen 10 men dragging a sledge with a boat on it. 5 whites put up a tent on shore and 5 remained with the boat. The Inuits and the whites stayed together 5 days, the former killing several seals and giving them to the white men. The whites attempted to cross to the mainland, and the Eskimos remained all summer on King William Land and never saw the whites again. She also said that the following spring she saw a tent standing at the head of Terror Bay. There were dead bodies in the tent, and outside, nothing but bones and clothing. Nearby were knives, spoons, forks, books, etc. While elated at his success in learning from the Ukjuliks these incidents, which added much to the reports of Ray and McClintock as to the fate of Crozier and his comrades, Schwatka was not content. With a courage bordering on rashness, he decided to cross Simpson Strait to King William Land and thoroughly search for records while the ground was free from snow. This meant passing the summer on this desolate island, for he could not hope to recross the strait, save by chance, until the autumnal clouds should form new ice. He had just learned that the island was so barren of game in 1848 that 105 men had there perished of starvation. Some of the natives told him that the same fate awaited the white men of today. Yet such was the dominating power of this fearless soldier that not only did his white comrades go forward zealously, but several Eskimos followed, including his hunter Tulua, of whom it was said, "There is a legend in his tribe that he was never known to be tired." Among the hunting feats of the natives was the spring duck hunting, when the birds are molting and unable to fly. Fitted with his spear, the Eskimo carries his kayak to the remote lake where the birds feed. Cautiously advancing until the flock is alarmed, he makes a furious dash toward the largest bunch. When within some 20 feet of the struggling birds, he seizes his queer-looking spear, with its 3 barbs of unequal length, and with an expertness gained from long practice hurls it at a bird which is nearly always killed, impaled by the sharp central barb. The wood shaft of the spear floats the game until the hunter reaches it. Scarcely had the party marched a single day on the ice pack of Simpson Strait when some would have turned back, the crossing being doubtful. Gilder records, "We would sink to our waists and our legs would be dangling in slush without finding bottom. The sledge often sank so that the dogs, floundering in the slush or scrambling over the broken ice, could not pull. Then we gathered around to help them, getting an occasional footing by kneeling on a hummock or holding on with one hand while we pushed with the other. Yet through the skill and experience of our Inuit dog driver, we made a march of 10 miles. In this journey, even the athlete, Tulua, was so exhausted that the party had to rest the following day. Schwatka, with Gilder and his other white companions, then made a most exhaustive search of the island, the Eskimos aiding in the intervals of the hunt or while going to and fro. The search revealed 4 despoiled graves, 3 skeletons, Crozier's original camp, and his daily bivouacs during his fatal southward march, the Erebus Bay boat, and the record deposited by McClintock in 1859. Especially interesting was the grave of Lieutenant John Irving, one of Franklin's officers. Evidently the body had been wrapped in his uniform and then encased in canvas as if for burial at sea. A personal medal of Irving's and other articles identified the remains. Unfortunately, none of the Franklin records or traces thereof were anywhere found. It is not to be thought that these marches and discoveries were made otherwise than with great suffering, with danger even of starvation. More than once they were entirely without food, and as a rule they lived from hand to mouth. Gilder relates this semi-humorous experience. While Klutschek was cooking the last of our meat, he left the fire a few minutes. The dogs, breaking from their fastenings, poured down on the culinary department like an army of devouring fiends. Tulu'a, knowing the state of our larder, slipped out under the end of the tent, stark naked from his sleeping bag, and by a shower of stones sent the dogs away howling. Their greatest discomfort arose from the lack of shoes and stockings, their outer footgear being soon worn out beyond repair, while hard travel had rubbed all the hair from their stockings. Under these conditions, walking was often physical torture, which frequent moccasin patching only slightly relieved. Finally, they had to send to the base camp at the south end of the island, where the two native women were, to obtain footgear for their return journey from Cape Felix, the northernmost point of King William Land. While sledging along this point, Tulu'a discovered a bear on the ice of Victoria Strait far to the north. Dumping his load, he urged his dogs forward, plying the whip until the team sighted the as yet unconscious bear. With wolf-like ferocity and swiftness, the excited dogs rushed madly forward, the empty sledge swinging from side to side on the rough ice floes or splashing through the pools or tide cracks that lay in the road. When within a mile or so of the bear, he saw his coming enemies, and with his lumbering, rocking gait rushes off at a speed that astonishes a novice who notes his awkward motions. Ukjulik, leaning forward, cuts the traces with his sharp hunting knife, freeing in a bunch the yelping dogs who run swiftly after the fleeing animal. Soon the dogs are at Bruin's heels, snapping and biting him so that he is obliged to halt and defend himself. A battle royal now occurs, the defiant, growling bear rushing and striking fiercely at his enemies. The old and experienced dogs attacked him either in the rear or by side rushes when his attention is given to another quarter, and when he turns they elude the clumsy brute with great dexterity. Now and then an untrained youngster attacks directly, only to receive a blow from the powerful paws that either kills or maims him. Soon Tulu'a came up almost breathless from his haste, and waited for a chance to get a shot without killing a dog. Gilder tells us of the unusual experience of the native at this time. The bear, disregarding the dogs, made a rush for the active young hunter that almost brought his heart into his mouth. Recovering his composure in good season, he sent 3 bullets from his Winchester rifle, backed by a charge of 75 grains of powder behind each, right into the animal's skull, and the huge beast lay dead almost at his feet. At times their hunger, when meat was lacking, was appeased by a small black berry called by the natives parawong, which was not only pleasing from its welcome, spicy, and pungent tartness, but was really life-supporting for a while at least. While making thorough search of every ravine or hilltop for records or for relics, the walking developed new tortures every day. We were either wading through the hillside torrents or lakes, which, frozen on the bottom, made the footing exceedingly treacherous, or else with sealskin boots, soft by constant wetting, painfully plodding over sharp stones set firmly in the ground with the edges pointed up. Sometimes, as a new method of injury, stepping and slipping on flat stones, the unwary foot slid into a crevice that seemingly wrenched it from the body. Under stress of hunger and in due time they came to eat the same food as their native hunters. We are told that, in the season the reindeer are exceedingly fat, the tallow, called by the Inuits tudnu, lying in great flakes from 1/2 inch to 2½ inches thick along the back and over the rump. This tallow has a most delicious flavor and is eaten with the meat, either cooked or raw. The intestines are also encased in a lacework of tallow, which constitutes a palatable dish. Indeed, there is no part of any animal used for food but what is eaten by the Eskimos and which we also have partaken of with great relish. A dish made of the contents of the paunch mixed with seal oil looks like ice cream and is the Eskimos' substitute for that confection. It has none of the flavor, however, of ice cream, but, as Lieutenant Schwatka says, may be more likened to locust, sawdust, and wild honey. After the breaking up of the winter floes in the strait, the hunters gave much time to the pursuit of the reindeer and killed many. Tulu'a gave a new instance of his courage and of his resourcefulness as a hunter. Going to the beach to find some driftwood for fuel, he left his gun in camp. Near the coast, he came upon a she-bear with her half-grown cub. Knowing that the game would escape if he went back for his rifle, he drove the old bear into the sea with stones and killed the cub with a handless snow knife. His great pleasure was in the slaughter of reindeer, of which great herds appeared during the late summer, while Schwatka was awaiting the coming of cold and the formation of ice on Simpson Strait for the crossing of his heavy sledges. Tulu'a indulged as a pastime in seal hunting in these days of prosperity. When he got a seal, one of his first operations was to make a slit in the stomach of the still-breathing animal, and cutting off some of the warm liver with a slice or two of blubber, the hunter regaled himself with a hearty luncheon. Now and then the keen scent of a dog or his own hunter's instinct discovered a seal igloo on the floe. This is a house built for their young near the air holes where the mothers come for breathing spells. Gilder says, "Here the baby seals are born and live until old enough to venture into the water. When a hunter finds an occupied igloo, he immediately breaks in the roof in search of the little one, which remains very quiet even when the hunter pokes his head through the broken roof. The young seal is easily killed with the spear, and the hunter waits for the mother, who is never absent a long time from her baby. The young seal is usually cut open as soon as killed, and its little stomach examined for milk, which is esteemed a great luxury by the Eskimos." Gilder gives an account of their camp life while waiting on events. "We ate quantities of reindeer tallow with our meat, probably about half of our daily food. Breakfast is eaten raw and frozen, but we generally have a warm meal in the evening. Fuel is hard to obtain, and now consists of a vine-like moss called ikshutik. Reindeer tallow is used for a light. A small flat stone serves for a candlestick, on which a lump of tallow is placed close to a piece of fibrous moss called munni, which is used for a wick. The melting tallow runs down upon the stone and is immediately absorbed by the moss. This makes a cheerful and pleasant light, but it is most exasperating to a hungry man as it smells exactly like frying meat. Eating such quantities of tallow is a great benefit in this climate, and we can easily see the effects of it in the comfort with which we meet the cold. It was most interesting to see the southward migration of the reindeer, which began as soon as the ice on Simpson Strait would bear them. They went in herds, and by the middle of October the country was practically bare of them. Of their own trip southward, Gilder writes, "The most unpleasant feature of winter traveling is the waiting for an igloo to be built, which is done at the end of every day's march. To those at work even this time can be made to pass pleasantly, and there is plenty that even the white men can do at such time. Another task that the white men can interest themselves in is the unloading of the sled and beating the ice and snow out of the fur bedclothing. The Eskimos do not use sleeping bags for themselves, but instead have a blanket which they spread over them, while under them are several skins, not only to keep the body away from the snow, but also to prevent the body from thawing the snow couch, and thus making a hole that would soon wet the skins. On the march, the bedskins are usually spread over the top of the loaded sledge, the fur side up, because it is easy enough to beat the snow from the fur, while it might thaw and make the skin side wet. Continued pounding will remove every vestige of ice without disturbing the fur if the weather is sufficiently cold." Of the dogs, he says, "Twice the dogs had an interval of 8 days between meals and were in condition for hard work. That they could live and do any work at all seemed marvelous. I am constrained to believe that the Eskimo dog will do more work and with less food than any other draught animal existing." Of the travel, he adds, "The weather is intensely cold, 97 degrees below freezing, with scarcely any wind. It did not seem so cold as when the wind was blowing in our face at 50 degrees below freezing. We were so well fortified against the cold by the quantities of fat we had eaten that we did not mind it. Conditions of travel were very bad in December, when they had to lie over for hunting, game being so scarce. But January 1880 was their month of trial, the temperature sinking to 104 degrees below the freezing point on one occasion, while they were harassed by a violent blizzard of 13 days' duration. Wolves later attacked their team, killing 4 dogs in their very camp. Indeed, Tula'a had a most narrow escape when surrounded by a pack of 20 wolves. He jumped upon a big rock, which was soon surrounded, and there fought the savage beasts off with the butt of his gun until he got a sure shot when he killed one. While the others fought over and devoured the carcass of their mate, he made the best of his opportunity to get back into camp. Through famine, cold, and wolf raids, the teams began to fail. It was almost our daily experience now to lose 1 or more dogs. In fact, they lost 27 on this trip. A sealskin full of blubber would have saved many of our dogs, but we had none to spare for them, and we were reduced to the point when we had to save it exclusively for lighting the igloos at night. We could not use it to warm our igloos or to cook with. Our meat had to be eaten cold, that is, frozen so solid that it had to be sawed and then broken into convenient-sized lumps, which when first put into the mouth were like stones. Sometimes, however, the snow was beaten off the moss on the hillsides and enough was gathered to cook a meal. In the last stages of famine, the party was saved by the killing of a walrus. Of conditions existing at this time, Gilder records, all felt the danger that again threatened them, as it had done twice before when they had to kill and eat some of their starving dogs. People spoke to each other in whispers, and everything was quiet save for the never-ceasing and piteous cries of the hungry children begging for the food that their parents could not give them. In this laudable effort to find the Franklin records, Schwatka and his comrades passed through experiences unsurpassed in Arctic life by white men, and that without loss of life or with other disaster. They adopted Eskimo methods of dress, travel, shelter, and life in general. As an expedition, it surpassed in distance of travel and in length of absence from civilized life, or of external support, any other known. It was absent from its base of supplies for a year, lacking 10 days, and traveled 3,250 miles. The success of Schwatka is important as showing what can be done by men active in body, alert in mind, and firm in will. He acted on the belief that men of force, well armed and intelligently outfitted, could safely venture into regions where have lived for many generations the Eskimos, who hold fast to the country and to the method of life of their ancestors. The most striking phases of the journeys of Schwatka and his white comrades evidence heroic qualities of mind and unusual powers of endurance, which achieved sledging feats that have excited the admiration of all Arctic experts. Such success, however, could have been obtained only by men of exceptional energy, practically familiar with field work, and gifted with such resourceful minds as at times can dominate adverse conditions that would involve less heroic men in dire disaster. The Franklin search by Schwatka, Gilder, and Klutschak was quixotic in its initiation, ill-fitted in its equipment, and rash in its prosecution. It was redeemed from failure through the heroic spirit of the party, which gained the applause of the civilized world for its material contributions to a problem that was considered as definitely abandoned and as absolutely insoluble. Such an example of accomplishment under most adverse conditions is worth much to aspiring minds and resolute characters. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Mark Ernest.
Chapter 19 of True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World by Adolphus W. Greely. Chapter 19. The Inuit Survivors of the Stone Age. Ye whose hearts are fresh and simple, who have faith in God and nature, who believe that in all ages every human heart is human, that in even savage bosoms there are longings, yearnings, strivings for the good they comprehend not, that the feeble hands and helpless, groping blindly in the darkness, touch God's hand in that darkness, and are lifted up and strengthened. Longfellow. It is now well known that the first country of the Western Hemisphere to be visited by Europeans was Greenland, nearly 1,000 years ago. The European settlement, the Christianization, and the abandonment of southern Greenland, covering a period of 3 centuries, has lately received interesting and exhaustive treatment by a famous Arctic expert who has brought together all existing data. Foreign to these investigations are the facts associated with the discovery during the past 100 years of 3 Inuit tribes of Greenland, previously unknown to the world. It seems astonishing that 900 years of Greenland's history and of its exploration should have passed without revealing the existence of the Eskimos of Itach, of Omavik, and of Angmagsalik. This narrative dwells more particularly on the finding of the tribe of Angmagsalik on the coast of East Greenland by Captain G. Holm, Royal Danish Navy, through whose heroic efforts and wise recommendations the tribe is now under the protecting influences of the government of Denmark and has become a Christian, well-cared-for people. In 1818, Captain John Ross, R.N., in an attempt to discover the Northwest Passage, though verifying discredited discoveries of Baffin in 1616, failed in his special effort. However, he added a new people to the knowledge of the world through meeting in the neighborhood of Cape York, Baffin Bay, 8 of the Inuits, now known as the Itach or Cape York Eskimos, whom he fancifully designated as the Arctic Highlanders. Elisha Kent Kane was the first to have familiar relations with and give detailed information about these isolated natives, the tribe in 1854 consisting of 140 persons. In later years, the Itachs have been frequently visited by explorers, whalers, and hunters. As the most northerly inhabitants of the world at the present time, they naturally have engaged the earnest attention of all who have met these hardy, kindly, and resourceful people. Kane's fear of their extinction was groundless, as against the number of 140 given by him, Peary's census figures of 1897 show 234, an increase of 94 in 40 years. Rasmussen relates that within the memory of man, but evidently since Kane's time, 14 Eskimos from the region of Baffin Land have joined the Etah natives. It is reasonable to believe that the origin of the Cape York Eskimo was through similar migrations, probably 2 or 3 centuries earlier. Prior to the 19th century, practically the only known Eskimo people of Greenland consisted of those under Danish protection who occupied the entire ice-free west coast from Cape Farewell, 60 degrees north, to Tasiusaq, 73 degrees and 24 minutes north. Traditions of the existence of tribes of natives on the east coast have long prevailed, but up to the 19th century there were known only a few individuals, quite near Farewell, which were visited by Wallow in 1752. Still among the Inuits of extreme southern Greenland were numerous and curious traditions of the inhabitants of the east coast, one to the effect that far to the northward were some light-haired people of European complexion. Another tale oft told in winter gatherings was one, doubtless in ridicule, of the occasional Inuit who, holding fast to a barren land, came west only to trade and never to live. It is a beautiful legend showing true and abiding love of home and country. Dr. Rink thus translates it: "A man from the east coast of Greenland, from love of his home, never left it even during the summer time. Among his principal enjoyments was that of gazing at the sun rising out of the ocean. But when his son grew up, he became desirous of seeing other countries, and above all, of accompanying his countrymen to the west coast. At length he persuaded his father to go with him. No sooner, however, had they passed Cape Farewell, and the father saw the sun about to rise behind the land, than he insisted upon returning immediately. Having again reached their island home, he went out from his tent early next morning, and when his people had in vain waited for his return, they went out and found him dead. His delight at again seeing the sun rise out of the ocean had overpowered and killed him. The first definite knowledge of the eastern Inuits came by accident, through the boat voyage of Captain W. A. Graah, who, under the directions of the King of Denmark, was searching for the ruins of the East Bygd, the colony of Scandinavians of the 12th to the 15th century. During this search, which extended to within sight of Cape Dan, Graah found no less than 536 Inuits living at about 20 different places. Of these, more than one half had never seen a white man. Graah says of them, "The affection the Eastlanders have for their children is excessive. Notwithstanding the little care bestowed on them, the children conduct themselves so as to seldom merit reproof. The East Greenlanders look on begging, especially for food, as a disgrace. As soon as a boy can creep about alone, his father gives him a little javelin, which he is taught to throw at a mark. He thus speedily acquires that dexterity in the management of this weapon, on which in after years he is to principally depend for his own and his family's subsistence. When he grows older, he is provided with a kayak, and learns to battle with the waves, to catch birds, and to strike the seal. When the youth comes home for the first time with a seal in tow, the day is made a holiday, and the friends and neighbors invited to a feast, at which, while he recounts all the circumstances of the chase, the maidens present lay their heads together to choose a bride for him. Their intercourse with each other is marked with singular urbanity. They are modest, friendly, obliging, and forbearing. When the howling of the dogs proclaims the arrival of strangers, the people hurry to the shore to welcome them and to invite them to their houses. The wet clothes of the visitors are taken from them and hung up to dry. Dry ones are lent in their stead, and if a hole is discovered in their boots, the landlady sets to work straightway to patch it. They are a gentle, civil, well-behaved set of people, among whom one's life and property are perfectly secure, as long as one treats them with civility and does them no wrong. Their veracity and fidelity are beyond impeachment. The northern lights they take to be the spirits of the dead playing ball with the head of a walrus. The principal encampments were between Kemisak and Omevik, beyond which place to the north, said the natives of Kemisak, there were no inhabitants. The Eskimos numbered 295 and were called the Omivekians. Of their environment in favorable places and their amusements Graah reported. The Coo had fields of a considerable extent, covered with dwarf willows, juniper-berry, black crakeberry, and whortleberry heath, with many patches of fine grass. The stream, abounding in char, had its source in the glaciers, of which several gigantic arms reached down from the height in the background. Flowers everywhere adorned the fields. 300 paces from the sea, the cliffs rise almost perpendicularly, with snow-clad summits, far beyond the average height. The natives had here assembled to feast upon the char, plentiful and of large size, the black crakeberry and angelica, gathering them also for winter use. They give themselves up to mirth and merrymaking. This evening, to the number of 200 or more, they began by torchlight their tambourine dance, a favorite festival. Graah believed that there were no natives living to the north of Cape Dan, and that, when the greater part of the Eskimos seen by him moved to West Greenland in the course of a few years, the whole coast was deserted. This belief was seemingly, though erroneously, confirmed by the fact that, while Clavering saw a few natives in 74° north, Scoresby, Koldeview, Ryder, Nuthorst, and the Duke of Orleans, in their explorations, saw no living native on the east coast. It remained for the expeditions of Hall, Nares, Greely, Amdrup, Holm, and Mylius Erichsen to prove, by their united observations, that there was not only an Inuit settlement on the east coast, but that such natives are the descendants of the true children of the ice, who have crossed Grinnell Land, skirted northern Greenland, and thus come eventually to their present habitat. Their fathers were formerly inhabitants of the most northerly lands of the globe, of the lands of Grant, Grinnell, Greenland, and Hazen, or Peary. Brief and transient may have been their occupation of many of the various encampments during their devious wanderings in the long migration, covering nearly 2,000 miles of travel. Their summer tent rings and stone winter huts dot the favoring shores of every game-producing fjord, from Cape Farewell in 16° north, northward to Brönlund Fjord, Hazen, Peary Land 82° and 8' north, on their nearest known land to the North Pole. They traveled leisurely, seeking fruitful hunting grounds and living on the game of the land or of the adjacent sea. They thus netted the salmon of the glacial lakes, searched the valleys for deer, snared the ptarmigan, lanced the lumbering muskox, speared the seafowl, caught the seal, slaughtered the walrus, and they are believed to have even pursued in kayaks and lanced the narwhal and the white whale. While Mylius Erichsen and his heroic comrades obtained definite information as to the extreme northern limit of Inuit habitation of all time, and paid the price of such data with their lives, it was with equal bravery but happier fortune that Captain G. Holm, rescued from oblivion, and thus indirectly raised to happier life, the struggling descendants of the iron men and women whose unfailing courage and fertile resourcefulness had wrested food and shelter from the most desolate and the most northerly land environment of the world. Once, in 1860, there came to the Cape Farewell trading station an Inuit who had lost his toes and fingertips. Though just able to grasp a paddle with his stumpy fingers, he was an expert kayaker and threw his javelin with the left hand. He said that he was from a place called Angmagsalik, and that between 800 and 1,000 natives dwelt in that vicinity. For nearly a quarter of a century this report of the existence of an unknown tribe of Inuits remained unverified. In 1883, however, the exploration of this part of East Greenland was made by a Danish officer of extended and successful experience in the governmental surveys of southern Greenland, who fully recognized the hazardous and prolonged nature of such an expedition. The Inuits said that many lives had been lost in attempting the shore ice of the east coast, and that a round trip to and fro Angmagsalik, far, oh so far to the north, took from 3 to 4 years. Thoroughly familiar with the native methods of life and of travel, this officer, Captain G. F. Holm, Royal Danish Navy, adopted the safest, indeed the only method of coast transportation in the umiak. The umiak, called the woman's boat, as it is always rowed by women, is a flat-bottomed, wooden-framed, skin-covered boat about 25 feet long and 5 feet wide. Only the framework, thwarts, and rowing benches are wooden, the covering being well-dried, blubber-saturated, hair-free skins of the attersoak (Greenland seal). Resembling in appearance the parchment of a drumhead, the sealskin becomes quite transparent when wet, so that the motion of the water is seen through it. Sometimes a light mast carries a spread sealskin for sail, but as a rule the boat is propelled by short, bone-tipped paddles, which in the hands of several strong women carry the umiak 30 miles a day through smooth, ice-free water. When going near the ice, a heavy sealskin is hung before the bow to prevent the delicate boatskin from being cut. When a little hole is worn through, the women deftly thrust a bit of blubber through it until the boat is hauled up on the shore, which must be done daily to dry the sea-saturated covering. These boats can transport from 3 to 4 tons of cargo, and are so light that they can be readily carried on the women's backs overland. Holm knew that his journey must entail at least one winter among such natives as he might meet, so that his equipment was very carefully selected, with a view to the gifts and trading which are so dear to the native heart. The northward journey was full of incident and of interest. Not crowding his women rowers, Holm tarried here and there for the hunt. Besides, he wished both to gather information from an occasional encampment and also to cultivate loyalty in his reluctant crew by permitting his women to show their west coast riches to the east coast heathen. Here seal were killed, and there the polar bear was chased, while the seafowl, the narwhal, and the white whale were the objects of pursuit to the eager native hunters, who accompanied the umiaks in their light, swift-flying kayaks. In voyaging there was the usual danger from sharp ice cutting the umiaks and necessitating repairs, and from lofty bergs and ancient hummocks as they crossed the ocean mouth of the ice-filled fjords. And alas, too often there were tedious, nerve-racking delays, when on desolate islands or rocky beaches the umiak fleet was icebound for days at a time. Wintering near Cape Farewell, Holm, with Gard and Knutsen, put to sea on May 5th, 1884, his umiaks being rowed by 19 women and 5 men, while 7 hunters followed in kayaks. Gard devoted himself to the precipitous, ice-capped coast, and between 60° and 63° north found nearly 200 living glaciers that entered the sea, 70 being a mile or more broad. In Lindenov's fjord at 62° and 15' north were found almost impenetrable willow groves near old Scandinavian ruins. Fine, new ice fjords were discovered, which put forth innumerable numbers of icebergs, the highest rising 200 feet above the sea. The western Eskimos were alarmed either at the ice difficulties which lengthened the voyage, or feared the Angakocks, or magicians of the east coast, and 19 of them insisted on turning back. Holm was obliged to send them back under guard, but with determined courage to fulfill his duty as an officer of the Danish navy, he went on with 12 faithful women and men, although he was not halfway to Cape Dan. As before told, Gra turned back in sight of Cape Dan, believing that he had reached the limit of human habitations. Great then was Holm's surprise to here find the last of the 3 missing polar tribes, who, to the number of 548 individuals, were occupying the fertile hunting grounds of the archipelago of Angmagsalik, which consists of about 20 ice-free islands to the west of Cape Dan, about 65° and 31' north, adjacent to the beautiful Sermilik ice fjord. In this district the tides and currents keep open the inland waterways, so that seals are plentiful and easily taken, thus making it an Inuit paradise. Holm and Knutsen here wintered, 1884 to 1885, and in their 10 months' residence with these people gathered a vast amount of ethnographic and historic material pertaining to the lives of these extraordinary Inuits who had never before seen a white man. Footnote: the data relative to this expedition is not available in English, but has been published in full in Volume 9, Meddelelser om Grönland, Communications on Greenland, in Danish text. With its generous policy, the Danish government has taken these natives under its fatherly protection, so that their future welfare is assured against exploitation, degradation, and early extinction. End of the footnote. This missing polar tribe pertains to the Stone Age of the world, its weapons being almost entirely of bone, while its methods of hunting follow lines long since abandoned by Inuits who have had contact with whites. Their high sense of fidelity was shown by Nafalik, who was placed in charge of stores left for the winter at Kassin-Gortok. That winter his family suffered from lack of food, but although these days of terrible distress and prolonged hunger, the stores of the white man were untouched by this faithful Eskimo. Of these natives Rasmussen says, "There is no people with a history which, as regards the bitterness of its struggle for existence and the eeriness of its memories, can be compared with that of the Eskimo. His mind can be calm and sunny like the water on a summer day in the deep, warm fjords, but it can likewise be savage and remorseless as the sea itself, the sea that is eating its way into his country." Of their endurance of cold, Poulsen records, "Inside the house both grown-up people and children wear, so to speak, nothing, and it does not inconvenience them to walk out into the cold in the same light dress, only increased by a pair of skin boots. I remember seeing 2 quite young girls walking almost naked on the beach, 15 minutes' walk from the house, gathering seaweed, though the temperature was about 24 degrees below the freezing point." As a dumb witness of their method of life in their permanent homes may be mentioned the house at Nualik, more than 100 miles to the north of Angmagsalik, discovered by Amdrup, where an entire settlement of 20 or more perished, probably of ptomaine poisoning from semi-putrid meat, a delicacy among the Eskimos, as is semi-putrid game with us. On the platform along the back wall, as shown by the skeletons, the inhabitants had once lain comfortably between the 2 bearskins, the upper one with the hair down. On the 5 lamp platforms stood the lamps and the stone pots. The drying hatches above them had fallen down, but remains of bearskin clothes still lay on them. Under the platform there were chip boxes and square wooden cases, and on the stone-paved floor large urine and water tubs. In front of one of the small side platforms there was a blubber board and a large, well-carved meat trough, and scattered about the floor lay wooden dishes, blood scoops, water scoops, besides specimens of all the bone utensils which belonged to an Eskimo house. Near the house stood 4 long heavy stones, placed edgewise, on the top of which the umiak rested, protected thus from the dogs. Scattered around were kayak frames and their bone mountings, hunting and other implements. Amongst the big heap of bones outside the house were the skulls of narwhals, dogs, and bears. Among the utensils was a blood stopper ornamented with a neatly cut man's head, which, recognized by old Inuits at Angmagsalik, identified this party as a northerly migrating band from the main settlement. Of the afterlife a glimpse is given by the talk of an East Coast Inuit to Rasmussen. On a lovely evening a broad belt of northern lights shot out over the hills in the background and cast a flickering light over the booming sea. Puarajik said, "Those are the dead playing ball. See how they fly about. They say that they run about up there without clothing on." Of the seamy side of life he adds, "But in the winter, when people were gathered together, the larders were full, and desires centered on the shortening of the long, idle winter nights, things would be quite different from the happy, industrious life of summer. Much food and sitting still, the desire to be doing, the craving for change, made people pick quarrels. Old grievances were resuscitated. Scorn and mocking, venomous words, edged on to outbursts of anger, and in winter feasts regrettable incidents occurred. Men and women, excited and goaded on by others, forgot all friendly feeling, and on most extraordinary pretexts often challenged each other to insult songs, fought duels, and committed most appalling murders. It is evident that among the people of the Stone Age there exists the same inclination to exploit and perpetuate deeds of individual and warlike prowess that appears not only in modern history as a whole but also in news of current publication. Acts of kindness, deeds of heroism, and displays of the fair and humble virtues that sweeten daily life are entirely absent from the old Inuit traditions. Yet these true tales depict the honesty of Nafalik, the humanity of Kalutuna, the fidelity of Brönlund, and the devotion of Mertuk. The total omission of similar tales of admirable and humane conduct from the legends and the folk songs of the Inuits of the Stone Age doubtless depends in part on the savage superstitions wherein magical powers and forces of evil are greatly exalted, and in part on the disposition to dwell on the unusual and the terrifying. So there are reasons to believe that the survivors of the Stone Age in East Greenland exhibit in their daily life human qualities of goodness and of justice that were characteristic of their rude and virile ancestors. Such, though inadequately described, are the newly found Inuits of the Angmagsalik district of East Greenland, the sole surviving remnant of the untutored aborigines of the North Polar lands. Their human evolution is of intense interest, as it has been worked out under adverse conditions of appalling desolation as regards their food and their travel, their dress and their shelter, their child-rearing and their social relations. That the world knows the last of the missing polar tribes, and that this remote primitive people is now being uplifted in the scale of humanity, must be credited to the resolute courage, the professional zeal, and above all, to the sympathetic human qualities of Captain Holm and his faithful officers and assistants. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World by Adolphus Greely. Chapter 20 The Fidelity of Eskimo Brönlund. And truly he who here has run his bright career, and served men nobly, and acceptance found, and borne to light and right his witness high, what better could he wish than then to die? Arnold. The Mylius Erichsen Arctic expedition of 1905 sailed for the east coast of Greenland in the ship Denmark, commanded by Captain Troll, Danish Royal Navy. Its purpose was to continue the remarkable surveys of the Danish government by completing the coastline of northeast Greenland. From its winter quarters at Cape Bismarck at 76 degrees and 14 minutes north, autumnal sledge parties established advanced depots of supplies in order to facilitate the travel of its surveying party the following spring. The field work was under charge of Mylius Erichsen personally, a Danish explorer of ability and experience, already distinguished for successful work in northwestern Greenland. It was planned that near the 82nd parallel of north latitude the main party should be divided so as to complete the work that season. Lieutenant Koch was to outline the southeastern shorelines of the land to the north of Greenland, while Mylius Erichsen was to carry his surveys inland until they joined those of Peary, thus filling in the totally unknown regions of extreme northeastern Greenland. This plan was carried out in the spring of 1906, the two parties separating at Northeast Cape, whence Koch struck courageously north on May 1st, with food for 14 days only. Game fortunately came to him and he was enabled to advance his country's colors to an unprecedentedly northern latitude for Denmark, 83.5 degrees north, and by his explorations to complete the survey of the most northerly land of the globe, originally named Hazen Land, which is now known as Peary Land. The brilliant discoveries, tragic experiences, and heroic struggles of Mylius Erichsen and his topographer Hagen, and the fidelity unto death of his Eskimo dog driver Jorgen Brönlund, are briefly outlined in this narrative. After the long winter of sunless days and bitter cold, it was with high hopes and cheery hearts that the long line of dog-drawn sledges followed Mylius Erichsen as they wended their way northwards at the end of March 1907. With 10 sledges and nearly 100 dogs, much was to be done by the resolute men who feared neither cold nor famine, the dangers of the sea ice, or the hardships of the trail. Their courage and strength were soon tested by difficulties and perils of unexpected character, for they thought to find the ordinary ice foot along the shore, which could be followed inward or outward as the character of the ice dictated. But there was no ice foot. Along Glacier Gulf, for the distance of 140 miles, the glacial ice cap of Greenland, known usually as the inland ice, moves summer and winter, with unbroken vertical front hundreds of feet in height, slowly but unceasingly into the Greenland Sea. Between the steady southward drift of the vast ice fields from the Arctic Ocean and the seaward march of the glacier, the shore ice was found to be of almost incredible roughness. Magnificent, and unequally elsewhere in the world, was the sight of this towering sea face, but scores upon scores of miles of ever-dominating ice cliffs through their weeks of struggle grew to be unwelcome, so that their end at Lambert Land was hailed with joy. Here came unexpected food, which did much to make the completion of the survey possible. As they were crossing the smooth fjord ice, Brönlund's keen and practiced eye saw far shoreward tiny specks of moving animals, and he shouted loudly, "Nanetok!" a bear. They proved to be 2 mother bears with cubs. In a trice the teams were stopped, the trace toggle slipped from the few dogs that were used to bear hunting, who started excitedly on the jump for the already fleeing game. Soon catching up with the lumbering animals, slow moving on account of the cubs, the dogs followed their usual tactics of nipping sharply the hind legs of the bear, who stops to drive off the dog or stumbles forward with the dog fast at his legs. Meantime, Brönlund and Tobias, the 2 Eskimo dog drivers, quickly threw off the sledge loads on the floe and drove on with such speed that the hunters were soon within shot. The bears skinned and the dogs fed, the northward march was renewed in high spirits, for the slow travel had sadly reduced their food. They were nearly in despair on reaching the south shore of Mount Malemuk, as the open sea made it impossible to pass around it. With exhausting labor they finally were able to clamber up a projecting point of the seaward flowing glacier, but their first supporting sledge here turned homeward. Difficult as had been the ice and the glacier scaling, they came to a real danger when around Malemuk they were driven far out on the ocean in order to proceed northward, for the inland ice was impossible of passage, and great areas of open water gave way slowly seaward to new ice. This was so thin that it bent and crackled as sledge after sledge tried in separate and fearsome order a passage that threatened to engulf them at any moment. Yet they came safely to Amdrup Land, 80 degrees and 43 minutes north, whence the last supporting party returned, charged to explore on their homeward journey the unknown fjords to the north of Lambert Land, where their spring discoveries of new lands had begun. Pressing on after the return of the supporting sledges, Mylius Erichsen was surprised and disappointed to find that the coast continued to trend to the northeast and not to the northwest, as indicated by all charts since Peary crossed the inland ice to Navy Cliff. This northeasterly trend greatly increased the length of the journey needful to complete the survey of the entire east coast. Their equipment had been planned for the shorter distance, and it was evident that this forced detour would soon leave them without food for themselves or for their dogs unless more game should be found. They thought that this extension would never end, but it was finally reached at Cape Northeast at 82 degrees and 30 minutes north, 12 degrees west, no less than 22 degrees of longitude to the eastward of Peary's location of the Greenland Sea in his discoveries of 1892 and 1895. The new cape was halfway between Navy Cliff and Spitzbergen, thus narrowing by one half the largest connecting waterway of the Arctic and the Atlantic Oceans. It was a magnificent discovery, for which some of these explorers were to pay with their lives. Mylius Erichsen and Koch counseled seriously together, and well they might. They had been on the march more than a month. Coming summer, with a disintegrating ice pack and the dreaded Malemuk mountain precipices, sea-washed at their base, were to be faced on their homeward journey, and to crown all, they had provisions for only 14 days. Imbued with the high Danish spirit, they duly weighed, with national calmness, the pros and the cons, only asking each other how and what, with their pitiful means, they could further do for the glory of Denmark. The heroic loyalty of both men found full expression in the decision that it was their bounden duty to go forward, and to finish the survey with which they were charged, regardless of possible dangers and personal privations. So Koch marched northward, while Mylius Erichsen turned westward toward Navy Cliff, nearly 200 miles distant. The westward explorations had been made much more important by the unexpected easterly extension of Greenland, which left a great gap in its northern shoreline that must at all hazards be surveyed. Starting with topographer Hagen and the Greenlander dog driver Brönlund, Erichsen reached a great inland fjord, Denmark, which he naturally took for the one charted by Peary as bordering the Greenland Sea. Though this detour carried him 100 miles out of the direct route to Cape Riksdag, it was not wholly without results. 21 musk oxen were killed, which restored the strength of the dogs, whose gaunt frames already alarmed the party. Here, with astonishment, they saw signs not alone of the beasts of the earth and the birds of the air, but everywhere were indications of their master, man himself. As they skirted such scanty bits of land as the inland ice had spared, they found along every bay or inlet proofs of former human life. There were huts and household utensils, left as though suddenly, circles of summer tents, fragments of kayaks and sledges, stone meat caches, fox traps, and implements of land hunt and sea chase, in which both reindeer and whales were in question. They were mighty hunters, these children of the ice, men of iron, who inhabited the most northern lands of the earth, and had there lived where these white voyagers of heroic mold were destined to perish. The signs of human life continued beyond Denmark Fjord to the very shores of Hagen Fjord, thus clearly establishing the route of migration over which the Eskimo of Arctic America or of the Bering Strait region had reached the east coast and possibly West Greenland coming from the north. Footnote: the discoveries of Lieutenant, now General Greely, around Lake Hazen, of Lockwood and Brainard in northwest Greenland and Hazen Land, prove that the route followed was via Greely Fjord, past Lake Hazen, across Kennedy Channel, over Hall Land, probably through the upper valley of Nordeskjold Inlet, and along the shores of Peary Channel to Denmark Fjord. End of footnote. The turning point of Ericsson's fortunes came at Cape Rigsdag, where he met Koch's party returning from the north. His discoveries and surveys of southern Hazen Land, Peary, where he reached 83 degrees and 30 minutes north, and his tales of game, encouraged Mylius Ericsson to go on, though he had food for 8 days only for the men, 11 for the dogs, and a few quarts of oil for cooking. Another fjord, Hagen, was discovered, which proved fatal to the party, as Mylius Ericsson felt that Navy Cliff, reported as overlooking the Greenland Sea, must surely be therein. He turned north, on learning his error, only to eat his last food on June the 4th. He felt obliged to cover his mistake by going still to the west to Cape Glacier, Navy Cliff, yet 9 degrees of longitude inland. Peary had there escaped starvation by large game, and Ericsson went forward knowing that without game death awaited him. Now and then they shot a polar hare, a bare mouthful for 3 starving men and 23 ravenous dogs. June 14th, 1907, Mylius Ericsson connected his surveys with Navy Cliff. Footnote. According to the lately published report of the gallant Danish explorer Mikkelsen, the recovered records of Mylius Ericsson show that the insularity of Greenland was not discovered by Peary at Navy Cliff. Peary Channel is only a fjord indenting northeastern Greenland, which extends northward, as shown in the attached map of Amdrup Land. End of footnote. He had a right to a feeling of pride and of exultation, for his magnificent series of discoveries, covering 5 degrees of latitude and 22 degrees of longitude, completed the survey of northeastern Greenland. Thus had these adventurous men given tangible form to the hopes and aspirations that for so many years had stirred the imagination of Danish explorers. These discoveries had involved outward sledge journeys of more than 700 miles, although the party was only outfitted for a distance of 330 miles. Lieutenant Trolle tells us how startlingly sudden was the change from winter to summer at the Denmark, Cape Bismarck. The temperature of the snow had risen to 0, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and then in one day it all melted. The rivers were rushing along, flowers budding forth, and butterflies fluttering in the air. One day only the ptarmigan and raven, the next the sanderling, the ringed plover, geese, ducks, and others. Mylius Ericsson and his comrade had a similar experience, just as they turned homeward. Almost in a day the snow covering of the sea floe vanished, as if by miracle. Here and there waterholes appeared. The dreadful fact was clear. The ice floes were breaking up. Forced now to the coastland, it was plain that return to their ship was no longer possible. They must summer in a barren, ice-capped land, and wait, if they could live so long, until the frosts of early autumn should reform the great white highway of Arctic travel. Mylius Ericsson hoped that the outlying valleys of his newly discovered Denmark fjord would afford enough game to enable them to live, at least long enough to permit them to reach some one of their depots where they could deposit the records of their surveys. They reached the fjord about the end of July, but alas, the big game of the past spring was gone. Now and then they killed a stray musk ox, and, like famishing creatures, men and dogs ate for months their fill. Again and again food failed utterly, but when death came too near, they killed, with sad hearts, one of their faithful dogs, until 9 of them had been eaten. In the recovered field journal of Brönlund, under date of August 7, we read, "No more food. It is impossible to travel, and we are more than 900 kilometers, 560 miles, from the ship. On the 8th, Erichsen started for the southern end of the fjord, thinking that in its ice-free valleys the chances of game would be increased. As it was necessary to travel on the ice floes, they started across the ice, changing from one floe to another when forced to do so. Unfortunately, they were driven offshore and found themselves adrift. Day after day, kept seaward by wind and tide, they strove in vain to reach shore, but it was 16 days before this was accomplished. When they landed on August 24, Brönlund writes, "We still have 14 dogs, but no food. We have killed one of these animals and eaten half of him. The other half will serve as our food tomorrow. The half of a dog for 3 men and 13 dogs is not too much to digest, and after eating it we are as hungry as before." When land was reached, Erichsen and Hagen applied themselves to hunting. Hare after hare and ptarmigan after ptarmigan were pursued and killed. But alas! The valleys were searched in vain for musk oxen or reindeer, as it was feared that the big game of the region was exterminated. Throughout these awful days of suspense and of hunger, neither Mylius Erichsen nor Hagen failed to maintain their courage and cheerfulness. In the intervals of needed rest, between the long, exhausting hunting tramps, they kept on the even tenor of their way. Erichsen wrote a little poem to distract the attention of his companions from their present surroundings. Faithful to the last to his favorite vocation, Hagen made with care and pride beautiful sketches of the country traversed and of the lands newly discovered. Thus passed away the brief polar summer, but further details are lacking, since Brönlund's journal has no entries from August 31 to October 19. Meanwhile, Koch had made safely his homeward journey, and although the anxiety of the officers at the ship was somewhat lessened by the news that game had been found in the far north, yet they were nevertheless uneasy as to the dangers of Erichsen's home travel. Koch, it seems, had found an open and impassable sea at Mount Malemuk, so that he was driven to the inland ice. He there found himself obliged to cross a very narrow glacier, where its seaward slant was so nearly perpendicular that a single slip would have precipitated men and dogs into the open sea, hundreds of feet below. Later it was decided to send a search party north, under mate Thostrup. Nor was this autumnal march without danger, even apart from the perils of travel along the coast, where the men nearly perished by breaking through the new ice. At Jokel Bay, Thostrup was driven to the inland ice, the only possible route. At all times difficult, this travel was now made especially dangerous by the fact that the old glacial surface was not yet covered by the hard-packed winter drifts. Thostrup's whole sledge party, on several occasions, barely escaped falling into the fearful crevasses seen with difficulty in the semi-darkness of the sunless days. As it was, several of the dogs were lost when, a snow bridge crumbling, the animals fell into a crevasse. Their sealskin traces breaking, the dogs dropped to the bottom of the ice chasms, which were sometimes 200 feet or more deep. With kindly hearts, the Eskimo drivers tried to shoot the poor animals and put them out of their misery, but did not always succeed. As Erichsen had not reached the coast, the journey was without result. Thostrup found untouched the caches of Lambert Land and Mount Malemuk and turned southward on October 18th, unconscious that 100 miles to the westward his missing shipmates, facing frost and famine, were valiantly struggling against fate and death. The condition of the Arctic crusoes of Denmark Fjord, though there were doubtless days of cheer and hope, grew gradually worse, and by the middle of October had become terrible, if not hopeless. Although the autumnal ice was now forming, Mylius Erichsen knew that in their state of physical weakness the long journey of 500 miles to the ship around Cape Northeast could never be made. Hagen agreed with him that the single chance of life, feeble though it was, lay in crossing the ice-capped mountain range direct to the depot of Lambert Land. Of course the height of the ice cap, the character of its surface, and the irregularities of the road were all unknown quantities. The state of their field outfit for the crossing of the inland ice betrayed their desperate condition. In general, their equipment had practically disappeared under stress of travel and of hunting. To the very last they had carried their scientific outfit and instruments. It was a sad day when they recognized that the only way of repairing the great rents in their skin boots was through the use of the sole leather case of the theodolite. Even that had quite gone, and without needle, thread, or leather, they could only fold wraps around their boots, now in shreds, and tie them on with such sealskin thongs as had not been eaten. The tent was badly torn, and with the sleeping gear, on which had been made sad inroads for dog food and patches for clothing, afforded wretched shelter against storm and cold. For transportation there were 4 gaunt dogs, the last that ravenous hunger had spared, to haul the remnants of the disabled sledge. The winter cold had set in, with almost unendurable bitterness to the enfeebled, shivering men. The weak Arctic sun, now skirting the southern sky at midday, was leaving them for the winter, so that the dangers of crevasses and the difficulties of glacier travel must be met either in total darkness or, at the best, in feeble, uncertain twilight. Discarding everything that could be spared, they reached the inland ice on October 19th, the day the sun went for the winter, and barefooted they traveled across this glacial ice cap 160 miles in 26 days. Their shipmate, Lieutenant A. Troll, says, "When I think of the northerly wind and the darkness, when I consider that every morning they must have crawled out of their dilapidated sleeping bags, though they could have had one desire, one craving, that of sleeping the eternal sleep, then my mind is full of sorrow that I shall never be able to tell them how much I admire them. They would go on. They would reach a place where their comrades could find them and the results of their work." Then at last came the end. The death of Mylius Erichsen and Hagen a few miles from the depot, and the last walk of Brönlund, crawling along on frozen feet in the moonshine. With the sure instinct of the child of nature he found the depot, ate some of the food, wrapped himself up in his fur, and died. By Brönlund's body was found Hagen's chart of their discoveries, and his own field journal, in which the final entry runs: "I perished in 79° north latitude, under the hardships of the return journey over the inland ice in November. I reached this place under a waning moon, and cannot go on because of my frozen feet and the darkness. The bodies of the others are in the middle of the fjord. Hagen died on November 15th, Mylius Erichsen some 10 days later." The courage and self-sacrifice of Mylius Erichsen and Hagen for the advancement of the glory of their country were based on conditions readily understood. Officials of high ideals, long in public service, honored with important duties, they possessed those heroic qualities which throughout the ages have impelled chosen men to subordinate self to the common weal. Of such has been said, "Gone, in a grander form they rise. Dead, we may clasp their hands in ours, and catch the light of their clearer eyes, and wreathe their brows with immortal flowers." These young explorers instinctively knew that their deeds of daring would give them fitting and enduring fame. Their faith in their country was justified by the tribute that Denmark promptly erected. But with Jørgen Brönlund, Greenlander, it was quite another tale. The virtues of self-sacrifice and of fidelity unto death are practically ignored in the traditional myth and tales of Greenland, which represent the literature, the religion, the history, and the poetry of the Eskimo people. Footnote: among 200 Eskimo tales and traditions given by Ring and Rasmussen, there does not appear to be a single one wherein the qualities of self-sacrifice and absolute fidelity are the essential or main ideas. End of the footnote. Brönlund had long foreseen the outcome, as appears from his journal entry, "We are all dead." From this early acceptance of his coming fate, and from the Eskimo racial trait of calm acquiescence in destiny, it would be natural that in the field the native would have first succumbed. But, charged with a solemn, vital mission, evidently receiving the commands of his leader as the voice of God, this Inuit was faithful even over fear of death, and by his heroic efforts, freezing and starving, ensured the fame of his comrades, and so added to the glory of his distant fatherland (Greenland is a colony of Denmark), unknown to him. Both through the dictates of his noble soul and also inspired by his leader, he rose to sublime heights of heroic action. All must indeed die, but he would to the last moment of his life be true to his sledge-mates, Ericsson and Hagen. Without doubt their last words were a charge not to fail to place in the cache at Lambertland the field charts and his own journal, so that Denmark might know that her sons had fulfilled their allotted duty. They mistook not their man, and the fame of Denmark's officers was ensured by the heroic efforts and unfailing fidelity of their humble subordinate, the Inuit dog-driver Jørgen Brönlund, Greenlander. Among the striking features of the beautiful city of Copenhagen are statuary by the famous Thorwaldsen and other great sculptors, which proclaim the fame and preserve the memory of kings and statesmen, of authors and admirals, men great in war and in peace, in civic worth and in learning. It is to the honor of the city that lately there has arisen a unique and striking memorial to commemorate worth and fidelity in fields far beyond the sunset, remote from commercialism and from civilization. Thus Denmark keeps fresh in the hearts and in the minds of her people the heroic struggle unto death of Mylius Ericsson and of Hagen, and of the Danish Eskimo Brönlund. Such steadfast sense of duty and heroic powers of accomplishment are not the heritage of Denmark alone, but of the nobler men of the wide world. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World by Adolphus W. Greely. The wifely heroism of Mertuk, the daughter of Shung-Hu. Deeper devotion nowhere hath knelt, fuller emotion heart never felt. Goethe, Dwight's translation. Rarely, if ever, has there been recorded in history a more varied and adventurous life than that of Mertuk, wife of Hans Hendrik, who came into literature through the magical pen of Elisha Kent Kane as the pretty daughter of Shung-Hu, an Etah Eskimo. She was born and reared as a veritable child of the ice, being one of the members of the northernmost tribe of the world, a people in the last century of absorbing interest as a surviving offshoot of the Stone Age. Mertuk married Hans Hendrik, an Eskimo of Moravian faith from Danish West Greenland, who was practically a deserter from Cain. This northern idol was the reverse of Ruth of the Bible, since for the sake of Mertuk, Hans abandoned his family and his country, willingly separating himself from the comforts and certainties of civilized life for the vicissitudes and inconveniences of an archaic environment. Despite a lovely wife, Hans soon discovered the wretched discomforts and unwelcome methods of life on the Etah coast, where hunger and physical sufferings were not infrequent attendants on even the most skillful and active hunter. When the polar expedition of Dr. Isaac I. Hayes touched in 1860 at Cape York, Hans joined the doctor's forces, taking his wife and child with him. Next year they emigrated to Danish Greenland when Hayes sailed south. 10 years later, Hans, with Mertuk and 3 children, joined Hall's North Polar expedition, which made a ship's record for the world. At Thank God Harbor was born Mertuk's youngest child, Charles Polaris, nearer the pole than any other known infant. With undaunted courage and uncomplaining fortitude, she endured with her 4 children, one a babe of 3 months, the fearful vicissitudes of the Polaris drift, set forth in another sketch, the marvelous ice drift of Captain Tyson, carrying her babe in her sealskin hood while dragging a heavy sledge over rough ice. With quiet dignity, in keeping with her cool equanimity and her unblanching acceptance of hardships in the white North, Mertuk accepted the extraordinary experiences incident to temporary life in the great emporium of American civilization, New York City, which she was the first of her tribe to visit. Returning to Danish Greenland with her children, she then passed the rest of her less eventful life, busy and happy in the domestic duties pertaining to her family and to her Inuit neighbors. The incident of Mertuk's wifely heroism, herein told in detail, is drawn from an unpublished diary of Mr. Henry W. Dodge, mate of the schooner United States, then wintering under Dr. Hayes at Port Fulk. The sketch of the childhood of this heroic and interesting woman is based on various passages of explorers and writers familiar with the incidents of Etah life. Among the forceful and friendly natives of Etah 60 years since, in the days of Cain, was Shung-Hu, famed equally for his qualities as a man and for his daring as a mighty hunter. He especially displayed his skill in the successful pursuit of the polar bear, whether on land along the coast, on the fast ice under the frowning snow cliffs of Humboldt Glacier, or on the moving ice floes of Smith's Sound. Apart from his alert action and dignified bearing, his person was notable through his ample whiskers, on chin and on lips, which age and exposure had already softened by their silvery coloring. Indeed, he was the only full-bearded native in the nation, as is related by Hayes, whose distressed and starving boat party was only able in the last extremity to reach the Advance through the aid of the Angkok Klatuna and his comrade Shung-Hu. Among the much-loved children of Shung-Hu was a daughter, Mertuk, whose mother's name is unknown, but she doubtless had that deep affection and tender care for her daughter which are common traits of these iron women of the Etah coast. Nature and necessity had made the family lead a life of constant wandering, and so the child shared the seasonal and oft irregular journeys along the shut-in, narrow coastland between the great Humboldt Glacier and the sea-beaten cliffs of Cape York. It was always a journey for food, birds and bears, deer and seals, walruses and narwhals, as time and good fortune dictated. Carried by her mother, little Mertuk traveled in true native fashion, thrust naked and feet foremost into the back part of the ample sealskin hood. There she rode in warmth and comfort, safely seated astride of a soft, rounded walrus thong, which passed under the arms of the mother and was made fast around her neck. Mertuk thus grew and throve, happy and healthy, under conditions which to boys and girls of our own country would have seemed impossible of endurance. Sometimes the tiny child would be thrust out in a temperature in which mercury would freeze solid, and with laughter felt the biting, stimulating cold that only made the hood more welcome as a home nest. It was the way of the wild, which must be followed in this country of sunless winters and of blinding blizzards, which every brave Inuit loved. To this Eskimo maiden the whole world was made up of a few score men, women, and children of the igloos, of a dozen kinds of birds in the air and on the cliffs, of white hares, bluish foxes, and reddish deer on land, of smooth seals, white whales, horned narwhals, and big-tusked walruses in the sea, and last but by no means least, the enormous amphibious, sharp-clawed bear, whose glistening, yellowish-white skin furnished material for the furry garments in which her father Shung-Hu was always clothed. At an early age Mertuk came to know the living creatures which were the sources of food and the means of life. She could tell the seasonal time in which came and went the wild fowl, of their breeding and of their young. The haunts and habits of the swift-footed animals of the glacier-enclosed land were all known to her, as well as the favorite resorts of the monsters of the bordering icy ocean, which furnished the hides and bones, the sinew and ivory, without which there would be neither needles and thread for the igloo nor lances and sledges for the hunter. It was a land of meat and flesh in which she lived, with no bread or vegetables, and the taste of sugar and of tea, the flavor of salt and of pepper, were absent from her food. She knew not books, matches, firearms, boats, stoves, crockery, nor cloth, whether of cotton or fiber, of silk or wool. It was a land without wood, iron, medicines, or stimulants, and equally without government, schools, churches, hospitals, or even houses, unless one could so name the stone huts, the skin tents, or the transient snow igloos. Her mother early taught her all the kinds of women's work which could make her useful to her tribe or to her family, and without doubt instilled in her a sense of some of the feminine graces which have softened the harshness of the world in all climes and in every country throughout the ages. Here they were a part of the life of the Stone Age, which the Etahs had inherited untainted by the outside world. The daughter's supple fingers soon braided evenly and closely the sinews of the narwhal into the tense and needful bowstrings, for Shung-Hu hunted reindeer with bow and arrows. Her strong hands tightly stretched the drying sealskin, through which later her bone needles and sinew thread were so skillfully plied that the skin broke before the seams gave way. With deft action and with an unwonted taste she so shaped her bird-skin clothing and blue fox hoods as to win praise for her garments from men and women alike. Her skill with the lamp soon became equal to that of the oldest expert of the tribe. Choosing and drying the long moss best suited for wicks, she applied a bit of walrus fat to the moss threads and twisted them into a dense, even roll. While other lamps gave forth volumes of smoke, Mertuk so skillfully trimmed the lighted moss wick that it gave an equal steady flame along the edge of the kudlik (pot stone lamp). An adept in all women's work, always in health, gay, witty, and even-tempered, Mertuk came also to be a comely maiden, well-formed in figure, fair of face, though very tiny in stature. But even in this land of Eskimo plenty there come seasons of dire distress, when famine stalks abroad and slow starvation strikes down the weaklings of the tribe. In such a time of want and hunger Hans Hendrik came to the Etah tribe to aid the half-famished folk in the hunt of the walrus, then needed to save from lingering death the sick men of Kane's ship, as well as the strong people with Kalatuna and Shung-Hu. Mertuk had watched from a distance this wonderful youth, who spoke Inuit queerly, to the sly amusement of the listening Etahs. But he carried a long, strange weapon, fire-flashing, ear-splitting, and death-dealing, that killed a bear or a walrus at great and unheard-of distances. In the brief intervals of the urgent hunt he came to Shung-Hu's igloo to sleep, to eat their scant fare, and to feed his wolfish dogs, which were ever fighting with those of Shung-Hu. The hunt was fast and furious, and with such success that steaks and liver, walrus skin, and rich blubber were again in plenty. Of the joyous feast after this particular hunt, in which Mertuk partook with other famishing Etahs, Kane quotes Hans Hendrik, an exact and truthful man, as saying, "Even the children ate all night. You, Kane, know the little 2-year-old, Awiu, possibly the mother of Mertuk, carried in her hood, the one that bit you when you tickled her. That baby cut for herself with a knife made out of an iron hoop, and so heavy that she could hardly lift it, cut and ate and cut, as long as I looked at her. She ate a sipak, the Eskimo name for the lump which is cut off close to the lips of the eater, as large as her own head. 3 hours afterward, when I went to bed, the baby was cutting off another lump and eating still. The work of the hunt proved too strenuous for the Danish Greenlander, and finally Hans was worn out by exposure and fatigue, while he fell sick from cold and wet. In this condition he sought the breek of Shung-Hu's igloo for rest until he gained strength to enable him to return to Kane, to whom he had sent walrus meat. The care of the strange Inuit fell on Mertuk. Prompt and gentle in her ministrations and attentions, jovial in her speech, and witty in conversation, she soon ensnared the heart of Hans. Indeed, from all accounts, she had that peculiar winning bashfulness that is so attractive amongst certain of the children of nature. Besides her tasteful dress, she had a sense of order and of cleanliness, not always found among the Etahs. She not only kept her long raven black hair unmatted, but had also gathered her tresses into a tuft on the top of her head, where it was fastened by a finely embroidered sealskin strap. This gave her a semblance of size and height quite needed, for she was only a trifle over 4 feet tall. Hans soon took careful notice of his nurse, who talked with overflowing mirth, while her busy fingers, in the intervals of personal service, unceasingly plaited the tough sinew thread with which arrowheads are secured or other hunting implements perfected. Deft and quick, busy with work, careful of her little brothers, she seemed to be the maiden suited to his taste, although the claims of other women were presented to him during his stay. Before he was strong, he had asked that she should become his wife. Most of her maiden comrades had sobbed and lamented when the time came for them to change the carefree, petted, and joyous child life for the onerous duties of an Etah matron. But Mertuk's heart glowed with happy feelings, and she sang with joy when the great Eskimo hunter, who had killed 3 of the 5 great walruses, asked that she should be his wife. Kane relates the story of the courtship as follows. Hans, the kind son and ardent lover of Fiskernaes, has been missing for nearly 2 months. I am loath to tell the tale as I believe it, for it may not be the true one at all, and I would not intimate an unwarranted doubt of the consistency of boyish love. Before my April hunt, Hans, with long face, asked permission to visit Peteravik, as he had no boots and wanted to lay in a stock of walrus hide for soles. I consented. He has not returned with the stories of him that come from Etah, were the theme of much conversation and surmise. He had given Nessark's wife an order for a pair of boots, and then wended his way to Peteravik, the halting place, where Shung-Hu and his pretty daughter had their home. This explanation was given by the natives with many an explanatory grin, for Hans was a favorite with all, and as a match one of the greatest men of the country. The story was everywhere the same. Hans the faithful, yet I fear the faithless, was last seen upon a native sledge, driving south from Peteravik with a maiden at his side, and professedly bound for a new principality at Uwaro, high up Murchison Sound. Alas, for Hans the married man! Lover as he was, and Nalagak, chief, by the all hail hereafter, joy go with him, for he was a right good fellow. Though Hans said that his mother-in-law had always behaved to me like a tender mother, and that the amiability of these unbaptized people is to be wondered at, yet life went hard with the married couple among the unchristened natives of the North. Touching at Cape York in 1860, Dr. Hayes found Hans and his wife living there. Of their quarters, Dodge, in his unpublished journal, says, "Their shelter was a sealskin tent, 6 by 8 feet in size and 6 feet high, in which lived Hans, Mertuk, the baby, and the mother-in-law. The breek of large stones took up, with the bedding, 2/3 of the space, leaving scant room for the cooking utensils. A small stone pot hung above the blubber-fed stone lamp." He continues, "Mertuk was with him, having at her back a baby not a year old. I must admit that Hans would not have been inexcusable for being allured by a pair of black eyes to cast in his lot with the roving tribes of the North. She is by far the handsomest native woman that we have yet seen, being much prettier than any woman of the mixed races of Danish Greenland. She is very small, but is finely featured, and has hands and feet as delicate as a child's. Notwithstanding the general harshness of the Etah language, her voice is quite musical, and she has the most gleeful, ringing, bell-like laugh that I have ever heard. Taking his wife and babe along, Hans joined the expedition of Dr. Hayes as hunter. In midwinter, as elsewhere related in Sonntag's fatal sledge journey, Hans went south as dog driver, with the astronomer, to buy dogs for the sledge journeys of the coming spring. After a month, Dr. Hayes, becoming greatly alarmed at their protracted absence, decided to send Dodge, the mate, south to trace the missing men. But deep as may have been the anxiety of Hayes for Sonntag, it did not equal the anguish of Mertuk's soul as to the fate of her loved Hans. The theory that the people of the Stone Age are purely animals, struggling only for food, for clothing, and for shelter, finds no support in the conduct of this tiny, ignorant, heathen woman, whose heart was filled with ideals of love and of duty. Living under conditions of ease and luxury far surpassing anything of which Mertuk's mind had before been capable of imagining, this tiny, uncivilized woman resolved to quit her abode of warmth and light for piercing cold and utter darkness, to abandon her abundant food and comfortable berth for a chance bit of frozen seal meat and a snow igloo. And for what reason? To find a missing husband, in search of whom a party was to take the field. To non-polar people, no words can convey an adequate idea of the dangers to be met, of the privations to be endured. It was a period of sunless days. The sun had been gone for more than a month. In the excessive cold of midwinter, at the season of fearful blizzards, along an uninhabited stretch of coast of utter desolation, in following which one must pass the dreaded Cape Alexander, either on the outer moving ice pack or along the treacherous ice foot at the base of its precipitous cliffs. And no one knew better than Mertuk the misery and hardships, the sufferings and perils which must be faced on such a journey. The tale of this woman's heroic resolution is thus told in his journal by Dodge, whom Hayes sent south to trace Sonntag's trail. Here let me introduce a little episode which might be useful to poets and novelists as an example of woman's constancy and devotion, showing perhaps that the true woman's heart beats the same in all ages, countries, and climes. It reveals itself equally strong in a Gertrude watching the livelong night beneath the scaffold, and in a simple, untutored savage going out alone under the shadow of an Arctic night, carrying a child upon her back and looking for a lost husband. Mrs. Hans Mertuk had discovered by some means that a searching party was being organized to discover the fate of the missing men. Being fearful that she would be detained if her intentions were known, she left the vessel an hour in advance of us, hoping that she would be allowed to keep on when she should be overtaken. This information was not pleasant for me, as those best acquainted with Eskimo character felt sure that she would not turn back, unless forcibly compelled to do so. Her intention was not suspected, however, and it was not until I was on the point of starting that one of the Eskimo told Jansen, the Dane, that Mertuk had gone in search of her husband. When we were on our way, 2½ miles from the ship, I discovered some distance ahead a little form, plodding through the snow, which I knew must be Mrs. Hans. In half an hour more we had overtaken her, and I must admit that it was an affecting sight to look upon this little woman, barely 4 feet tall. With her child only a year old on her back, Mertuk plodded bravely along through the snow, into which she sank knee-deep at almost every step, impressed with the idea that the dearest one on earth to her was somewhere in the vast desolation before her, and fired with the feeling that she must find him or perish too. As my companion, Christian Petersen, the Dane, could make her understand him, I told him to tell her that she could not go on, but must go back, while we would go on and look for Hans, explaining the reasons for her return. But to all his arguments Mertuk simply said that she must find Hans or die, and resolutely she set her face toward the south. While Christian talked to her I stood by, leaning on my rifle, awaiting anxiously the result of a discussion that I could not understand, except as I read the woman's face. We could not spare the time to go back with her. She could not accompany us, for our pace was too rapid for her, and besides we must not be delayed in our mission. If she followed us, she would be soon worn out with fatigue, carrying her child through the soft, deep snow, and if she sat down to rest, her fate was certain when overcome by sleep or through exhaustion. When Peterson said that he could do nothing with her, as she obstinately declared that she was going on for her husband, Dodge, greatly disturbed, was perplexed as to what action he should take. Fortunately, there came to his mind a thought, kindred to that so forcefully and beautifully expressed by Tennyson in his lines, "Home they brought her warrior dead." And he continues, "Finding that Christian's arguments were likely to prove unavailing, I stepped up to Mertuk, lifted up a corner of the reindeer skin that she had thrown over her sealskin hood, and pointed to the tiny baby who was sleeping quietly, and said in English, 'If you go on, the child will die.'" She could not understand my words, which the Dane did not translate, but something in her heart must have disclosed their meaning. For the first time she showed signs of irresolution, and her eyes filled with tears. Carefully covering the child's face, I brushed from the mother's hair and eyebrows the frost feathers that had already formed through the awful cold. Looking steadily into her eyes, and talking in a low, firm voice, I told her that I would look faithfully for Hans and bring him back to her if he could be found. I shall never forget the expression of her countenance, the moonbeams streaming down on her eager upturned face. Her lips were slightly parted, and her whole soul seemed to be shining through her expressive eyes, which were fastened fixedly on mine. When I ceased speaking, she answered, talking in an eager, impassioned strain, which made her meaning plain enough, though her speech was in an unknown tongue. Finally she pointed to the south, and said that she would go on, but the trembling tones of her voice did not show the same firmness as it had done before. Christian would have interpreted, but it was unnecessary. The woman and I understood one another, and I felt that the victory was won. Again I spoke to her in the same tone as before, and as she listened her eyes were once more dimmed by tears. I was sure that her determination was wavering. Now pointing first to the child, and then in the direction of the ship, I told her that she must go back. Though she felt my meaning, she stood for a moment, most resolute in her attitude, gazing intently into my eyes until she must have seen something forbidding in my unrelenting face. Dodge later writes, "To fully appreciate the impressive effect of this most dramatic incident, the conditions under which it occurred should be remembered. We were far out of sight of the ship, were some distance offshore on the main ice pack of Smith Sound. The moon was shedding a dim, ghost-like glare upon us, and it was the coldest day of the winter, the thermometer indicating 75 degrees below the freezing point." He humorously adds, regarding his forceful language in ordering Mertuk back to the ship, "I will not swear that the vigorous words froze as they came from my mouth, but after I finished there were pendant icicles an inch long to my whiskers and mustache." As to Mertuk, orders, arguments, and requests, whether in pantomime English or in Danish Eskimo dialect, would have utterly failed of effect, had she not been stirred by frequent allusions to her baby, Hans' child, who must be saved from danger of death. To the mother, cold, hunger, and privations were as naught. Long and bitter was the conflict in Mertuk's heart between her motherly affection and her wifely devotion. Should she do alone her duty to her infant, or should she put the child's life aside in her Arctic quest for her missing hunter husband? To the last her heart was undecided. Now she turned to the north, taking a few steps toward the ship. Then she flew hard on the trail after the searching party, which had now moved onward. Finally, with a gesture as of despair at adverse and inexorable fate, she slowly took up her lonely march back to the ship, where food, warmth, and shelter awaited at least the child of Hans. On shipboard, Mertuk did not cease to bewail her weakness in returning from the search, until the very day when Hans, who by no means hastened his return, came back to fill her heart with that sweet content which was absolutely ensured by his presence alone. By modern standards, this woman of the Stone Age was low in the scale of humanity, uncouth, ignorant, a heathen, and even brutish in a way. This tale of an Inuit girl is, however, but a loose leaf from the history of woman, which indicates that the spirit of altruistic devotion is an attribute implanted by God in the primitive races, and not, as some would fain have us believe, the golden fruit of developed humanity. A century since an American poet paid due homage to a beautiful belle, who later became his wife, in verse that aptly depicts the lovable traits of Mertuk, the daughter of Shung-Hu. Affections are as thoughts to her, the measures of her heart. Her feelings have the fragrancy, the freshness of the flowers. End of chapter 21. End of True Tales of Arctic Heroism in the New World by Adolphus W. Greely.